Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for staying with us. It's been a long day, and so we are happy that you have joined us for this very interesting and what we hope will be a very robust discussion on tax, international financial flows, and governance. Before I introduce myself and the topic and the rest of the panel, I just want to apologize for the absence of Professor Atia Warris, who would have been on your program. Atia suffered a painful loss in the death of her father. And so, of course, we wish her all the condolences. My name is Marlene Nembhard-Parker. I am Deputy Commissioner General Legal Support with Tax Administration Jamaica. And I also wear the hat of co-chair of the BEPS Inclusive Framework. And I'm also a member of the United Nations Committee of Tax Experts. With me, I have an expert panel who need no introduction and who are well respected and esteemed for their body of work. To my immediate left is Abdul, Muheet, Chowdhary from the South Center. Next to Abdul is David Bradbury, and David is acting Deputy Director of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD. And next to David is Markus Meinze. I hope I've gotten your name correct, Markus. And all of these gentlemen are well-versed in the topic that we are going to be tackling this afternoon. So the discussion will focus on the impact of tax, international financial flows, and governance as they relate to sustainable development. Tackling these particular issues has dominated work in the global tax landscape for perhaps the past 13 years. And most of the work has been done by the OECD, who has adopted the role of standard setting and has mobilized countries by way of the multilateral platforms of the Global Forum on Tax Transparency and the BEPS Inclusive Framework. The issue of international financial flows is usually dominated by a discussion on illicit financial flows. However, the organizers of this conference purposely did not refer to illicit financial flows in the topic in order for us to have a broader discussion. International financial flows are an integral part of the global economy and should not be viewed as illicit in nature, but rather recognized for what they are in terms of cross-border commercial activity. However, developing countries are generally capital importing countries, and it is felt that the global tax allocation rules are skewed too far in favor of developed countries. The question of the allocation of taxing rights, therefore, has become even more of a focus as the OECD Inclusive Framework two-pillar solution unfolds. Allocation rights is one of the concerns in international financial flows. The other concern, which is more pernicious and persistent, is that some of these financial flows are illicit. And despite efforts made, more notably through the OECD on transparency standards and BEPS, it is estimated that the overwhelming majority of IFFs are due to commercial tax avoidance by way of profit shifting, with one credible report estimating it to be about 60%. Developing countries, particularly those who rely heavily on corporate income tax, are most impacted by this. Typically, IFFs are also accompanied by the vagaries of corruption and money laundering. The combination of these three are not just threats to law and order or domestic resource mobilization. They can destabilize and undermine any attempt at national development, much more sustainable development. In terms of governance, the related topic, much of the discussion of governance in tax, and particularly in the global tax landscape, has focused on tax transparency and the standards set by the OECD on EOI and AEOI. The implementation of these standards have been directly linked to enhanced revenue collection, and over time has yielded approximately 112 billion euros in revenue. But we'll be looking not just at tax transparency in terms of tax administration. We also want to explore what is the role of business, civil society, and indeed the political directorate in ensuring that the rules of transparency and accountability are embraced as standards for sustainable development. We will also look at the issue of institutional global tax governance. And so at this point, I will hand over to David to start us off. And David will be followed by Markus, and then by Abdul, and then by Vera, who is joining us remotely. David, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Marlene, and it's great to be with you all, to join you for this conference, and particularly for this panel. What I'd like to do over the next few minutes is to give a little bit of background, to paint the picture that hopefully will then allow for a more engaging and interactive discussion amongst all of the panelists. But when we look at this topic, tax, international financial flows, and governance, one of the things that strikes me is that this is very much about the question of international tax cooperation in order to support domestic resource mobilization. And if you think about international tax cooperation, we talk about it a lot these days. It's something that we regularly discuss at conferences such as these. But when you think about it, international tax cooperation is actually a relatively new phenomenon, at least at the multilateral, in the multilateral context. Now, just to explain what I mean by that, international financial flows or cross-border trade, cross-border activity has been a part of an increasingly global economy for the last, at least the last 100 years. You could go back even further if you really want to. But that globalization and through digitalization, this enmeshment of the global economy has rapidly accelerated in recent years. And with that, we have seen some changes in tax governance and in the way in which we engage, the way in which nation states engage with each other. So you go 100 years ago and you go back to when the League of Nations established the first, effectively the first model tax treaty. And then you think about what happened those decades after that. And for a very long period there, you basically had the OECD producing a model tax convention, you had the UN producing a similar model, and countries were then in their bilateral engagement with each other would draw upon those documents. But to some extent, that was really the extent of multilateral cooperation on international tax matters. I think what has really changed dramatically in the last decade in particular has been the extent to which countries have come together to try and regain the initiative, as it were, when it comes to issues of global tax planning and the ability to enforce the sovereign tax rules of any country within its borders and to the extent necessary beyond. And so we've seen things like the standards on exchange of information on request, automatic exchange of information. We've seen the establishment of the Global Forum, which now has 165 members. We've seen the BEPS project. This was a really significant project in many ways because it represented one of those significant step forwards in terms of countries coming together to work with each other, to ensure that there was coherence in the rules that existed within their countries and in their treaties, and precluded the opportunities for multinational enterprises to take advantage of mismatches and gaps and loopholes in those rules. And so the OECD has been very proud to be a part of that ongoing process and that development. And that process has evolved over time as well. If you take the tax avoidance space, so leave the transparency space to one side for a moment. You think about the tax avoidance space. The base erosion and profit shifting project, when it was launched in 2012, 2013, it was basically OECD and G20 countries. Now you could say, well, collectively they account for about 80% of global GDP, so that's a pretty big step forward. And at the time, it was seen to be a really big step forward because global cooperation had never really occurred in tax matters on that scale. So you fast forward another couple of years into the future, you have some standards to implement, and the G20 says, well, but what about the rest of the world? We need to make sure that if these are going to be effective, we need to work with other countries that are not OECD countries and not G20 countries. And then eventually we set up the inclusive framework on BEPS, which today has more than 140 jurisdictions coming together on an equal footing. And as we've gone through this most recent evolution of the international tax cooperation journey, we've been engaged in this discussion around the two-pillar solution, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I won't go into them in detail. I'm sure you're very well versed in the details of those two pillars. But to make this point, that process of rule setting did not just have OECD countries at the table. It did not just have OECD and G20 countries at the table, but it has had a much broader and more diverse group of countries contributing to that process. And when you look at the design of the pillars, and I won't go into it in detail at this point, perhaps later in the discussion it might be worth covering some of this territory, but there are various elements of design that I can point to and I can say that was because of developing country contribution to the discussion. And that didn't happen 100 years ago when the League of Nations was considering these issues. It didn't happen 10 years ago when the BEPS project was being launched. But it has happened over the last couple of years as part of this ongoing work that the inclusive framework on BEPS has been moving forward. Of course, there's always more to be done. But I think we should recognise the important progress that has been made. Just one final observation I'll make at this stage of the discussion, and this is really just some scene-setting observations, is to say that one area where the inclusive framework, I think, has really been able to support developing countries through the current tax reform discussion has been with questions of impact assessment. Now, when you're considering complex reforms of the sort that we're talking about with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, it's very difficult for many countries, not just developing countries. In fact, many larger economies may not even have the technical capacity or access to data to properly understand the implications of these reforms. But the OECD has been working with all of those inclusive framework members to bring together the best available data. That's not to say it's perfect. To bring together the best available methodologies and to inform countries of the implications, not just of proposals once they've been agreed, but on an iterative process through the development of these proposals so that countries can actually make the case when design is being considered, fully informed of the fiscal and investment implications of these decisions. Now, I think that's something that, for all of the imperfections in any process, I think that's something that should be acknowledged and should be recognised, because what it has meant is that there has been a much more inclusive process in working towards delivering some standards. There's still work to be done before they can be implemented. And we certainly look forward to working closely with so many of you in this room, but with inclusive framework countries, developed, emerging, and developing alike. Because at the end of the day, if these rules are to be durable, they need broadly based support across the global community. And for better or for worse, and some will argue for better, some will argue for worse. The OECD and the Inclusive Framework on BEPS has emerged as the forum and the venue for those very important and serious discussions to take place. And when we think about that in terms of the broad sweep of history, I think it's been a really significant movement forward when it comes to tax cooperation. So I'll leave my remarks there. Thanks very much, Marlene.
So, Markus.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a few slides I would like to walk you through. I'm not sure if we can bring them up here on the screen. So 2 points I want to make in those next few minutes. The first point, presenting a few data and findings that question whether the international tax governance setup is fit to curb illicit financial flows, and most importantly, if the OECD is the right forum to do so, and is actually able to deliver that mandate to curb illicit financial flows. I will also share about the UN alternative tax convention that is at the moment in discussions at New York. Not sure if we can share the screen, maybe, yeah, it's there, great. And then I will also share, secondly, some approaches and data on what can be done right now to curb illicit financial flows, some projects that we have, some data that we have been engaging in that might be of relevance for the research and tax administration among you. So let's start perhaps by remembering how crucial the OECD is for the international economy. This chart shows in black those areas where the OECD tax rules directly claim jurisdiction. This is the second column is trade, intra-group and independent party trade. Then is FDI, the third of those columns, the stock of FDI, world FDI stock. And the final column is financial investments, so portfolio investment and banking assets. All of these are regulated in some way or in one way or the other by OECD tax rules. On the left hand, you see the column on world GDP in 2016, just for a comparison, 76 trillion. So the takeaway from this, let's not go into the details here, it's just a substantial share of global economic activity and wealth is at the moment regulated by the OECD tax rules. This chart here is plotting countries against their role in enabling illicit financial flows and tax abuse. On the x-axis, you see the secrecy score of countries. So how intensely do countries provide golden visas, banking secrecy, anonymous ownership company, and other facilities to enable illicit financial flows, to enable a criminogenic environment, 80 here being the most secretive ones. And on the y-axis, you see the intensity of the aggressiveness of how countries enable multinationals tax dodging in their laws. These are based on very thorough and meticulously researched legal comparative analyses across 20 indicators in each of those scores, with over 100 data points, really publicly accessible and referenced to source. So this is not invented. This is, you can double check it, it's online available. And again, 100 on the y-axis, Haven's score means most aggressiveness of corporate tax policies. Now you see three groups of countries here. The black dots are OECD member states. The black squares are OECD dependencies, like the Cayman Islands or Curacao, etc. And the gray dots are neither of both. And you can see an interesting pattern here. On the bottom left quadrant, the most transparent or least aggressive countries, you see a lot of OECD members, the black dots. But on the top right quadrant, which is the most aggressive and most secretive area of countries, you see the OECD dependencies. So there seems to be a story here that the OECD is outsourcing its dirty business of enabling illicit financial flows to its dependencies. One outcome of this is that we have a lot of FDI routed through the OECD dependencies. We have here a log scale of FDI over GDP, with the top dotted line here being the OECD dependencies, with an extreme growth of FDI over GDP in the last decades. So this is not really FDI. this is just tax avoidance, that mainly, right? Let's not be mistaken that although this is measured by FDI statistics, this growth of FDI is harming your country. It's not desirable for any country to have more of that. A second outcome here is that we have very high global tax revenue losses for most countries. And this is data from 2020. We have a more recent estimation, 2021, that increased the total to 483 billion. But a more important point here is, I want to draw attention to the right part of this chart. The relative distribution in percentage of total tax revenue, lower income countries are 2 to 3 times more heavily affected and suffering from those tax losses inflicted by the current international tax setup. The third outcome here is that since the BEPS has started in 2013, this is a study that was published today by Ludwig Wehr and Gabriel Zuckman, that looked at the total amounts of profits shifted, and they arrived at a 1 trillion estimation now of profits shifted, and it keeps increasing. You see, since 2013, it's a steep increase even. So after BEPS has started supposedly to tackle base erosion and profit shifting, the problem has increased. It's not a reversal. We are not living in a world where the OECD has made progress. No, the OECD has prevented progress by everybody from enacting alternative policies that would have curbed this by occupying the policy space and determining what rules should be enacted and should be allowed to be enacted by countries. So the OECD, therefore, you could argue, has been playing a rather counterproductive role here. If we take these facts together and we combine it also with the fact that the OECD and the Inclusive Forum have ignored most requests and most input by non-OECD member countries, culminating in the ITAF, the African Tax Administration Forum, most recently asking explicitly for an end to coercion by OECD members towards their constituencies. I wonder if we can really rightfully ask ourselves, could it be that the OECD's role of tax rules making for the whole world is a racialized neo-colonial exercise par excellence, continuing the history of the OECD as a club of former imperial and colonial powers set up at a time in 1960 when they intended to manage the transition from their former colonies to supposed independence. Therefore, could it also be that tasking the OECD with setting global tax rules or fixing the global tax system can only result in suboptimal, if not counterproductive, international tax policies for attaining these sustainable development goals, for suboptimal tax policies for low and middle income countries that overall exacerbate tremendous inequalities. And let's not forget, these inequalities are the common denominator of all the crises that we have at the moment been discussing in the last 2 days, the multiple crises that we are facing. They are all coming down to exacerbating inequalities that are of a tremendous scale already in the world. Now, let's not end here in a negative way only. There's hope in the sense that there's at the moment 2 resolutions being discussed in New York by the United Nations that would change that global international setup. There's one resolution proposed by the African group to set up a UN tax convention precisely to open the policy space that the OECD has been constraining for decades, right? And the other resolution is by the G70 group of countries to upgrade UN tax committee at least to an intergovernmental body in order to better counter and curb illicit financial flows. So I think it's unlikely that we are going to see anything of BEPS implemented in the near future anyway. The US is dropping out. They have their own unilateral CAMT, corporate alternative minimum tax, already enacted. Why would they join Pillar 1 or 2? So how would you envisage a world in which the OECD would force an agreement on the rest of the world, when the rest of the world is already very skeptical about the benefits that is in there for them, if not even the G7 can agree among themselves on that being a good solution. So I think once we have left behind the OECD shackles in tax policy making, many options become feasible. And some of them are already used by OECD members themselves, like alternative minimum taxes, digital services taxes, etc., etc. Now I want to switch to the second point I want to make. What can we do now in terms of countering illicit financial flows? What options are there? There's many more than I just will present, just a few ideas that we have and we have been working on in the past, and that could be interesting to you as researchers and maybe administration officials. A start is to understand the macro risks of your country. And we have an illicit financial flows vulnerability tracker online that has data for all countries in the world. It derives data from bilateral data sets on trade, FDI, portfolio investment, and banking information, and combines this with the measures of legal opportunities for illicit financial flows, like the Haven score and the secrecy score, to arrive at an overall measure of vulnerability in each of these channels. Now, this is at a macro level. We have also been taking this to the micro level and have worked with some administrations to better target scarce audit resources to those cases with most likelihood of illicit financial flows. The idea is here, in Nigeria, for example, we have devised a data-driven red flagging exercise of targeting those multinationals for tax audits that have most geographic risk, like who are most invested in their related party transactions in corporate tax havens. And thereby you can easily sequence all the universe of your multinationals operating in your country by the risk they pose. That is a good thing. I don't want to only say negative things about the OECD. There's the data that has been produced in that regard. For example, the transfer pricing disclosure forms in BEPS Action 13 is a precondition to make this kind of analysis. So there's data, not enough data available yet, and not publicly enough, and not with too many conditions, broadly speaking, in many regards, what the OECD data is providing. But this is a type of data that is useful for these type of analysis and assessments of risk. So please, if you are interested to explore further potentials to collaborate on this, let's have a chat. And finally, to the researchers among you, I want to also alert you to us launching a data portal in November, where all of this data that we are using here is available and downloadable and filterable by different country and ID and also years. I'll end here and hand over perhaps to Abdul. Thank you.
Can everyone see? Okay. So good evening. Nice to be here, and thank you for your interest. So that was a very interesting presentation by Markus, which I'll sort of be following up on. So I'm a senior program officer at the South Center, which is an intergovernmental think tank of developing countries. We have 55 member states from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And in my presentation, I'll be looking at the topic of governance specifically. And I'll be sort of building on what Markus had pointed out about some of the reasons why there is dissatisfaction with the some of the outputs of the OECD, specifically the two-pillar solution amongst developing countries. And here you could look at the statements by the African Tax Administration Forum, the G24, and of course my own organization, the South Center, where we have commented on various aspects of the two-pillar solution and what are some of the key deficiencies and why developing countries have some concerns with regard to these. These provide the context to further fuel the long-standing demand by the developing world for a UN tax body, because the reality is that as of now, there is no single intergovernmental tax body which exists. And the developing world's demand is that this should be at the United Nations. And there have been three important developments which I'll build on, which Markus had referenced. One is the UN Tax Convention. The second one is on the intergovernmental tax body. And the third one is on a UN multilateral instrument, also known as a fast track instrument. Now, coming to the first one, the UN Tax Convention. This was introduced in October in the second committee of the General Assembly. So this last month by Nigeria on behalf of the African group. And this would seek to create an international convention on international tax cooperation. Now, what specifically the convention would do is something which is still to be negotiated. So the resolution, which itself is being negotiated, aims to set up an ad hoc committee which would negotiate the terms of reference, which would then elaborate what the convention would do. But this has been fueled by African countries in particular, which have been quite dissatisfied with the two-pillar solution. Because if you know, 4 countries have rejected the two-pillar solution, which are Kenya, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And both Kenya and Nigeria are significant players in Africa. So this topic of a UN tax convention has built on a lot of previous work, notably the FACTI panel of the United Nations, which was set up by the joint presidency of the Economic and Social Council and the General Assembly. So Norway and Nigeria had initiated the FACTI panel, which was on international illicit financial flows, and it recommended a UN tax convention. So that was a recent thrust behind this. And of course, there have been other proposals which have developed what such a convention could do. One of them is a paper by the South Center, and the other one is a civil society proposal for a UN tax convention by Eurodad and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and the links are over here, which you are welcome to look at. Coming to the second proposal of a UN tax body. This is arguably the oldest demand of the G77 plus China, which is the voice of the developing countries. They have demanded for more than a decade that the UN Tax Committee, which is officially known as the UN Committee of Experts on International Cooperation on Tax Matters, should be upgraded from its current status as an expert body in their individual capacity into an intergovernmental body where the representatives are delegates of their countries. So this would provide a genuinely universal tax body where all countries, developed and developing countries, can really come together on a genuinely equal footing and make international tax standards. So this has been introduced also this last month in October in the second committee of the General Assembly by Pakistan on behalf of the G77 plus China. So this is another important boost to this long-standing demand. And the third one, which in a way is a new demand, is that of a UN multilateral instrument, also known as a fast-track instrument. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, I'll just give you a brief background. You had the 15 actions of the base erosion and profit shifting project by the OECD, which wanted to stop tax avoidance. And action 15 was a way to include these 13 action points into existing bilateral tax treaties. Because the question came that once we agree on what these measures are to stop tax avoidance, how do we put them into tax treaties? So the OECD came up with something innovative called a multilateral instrument, which was one legal instrument which would update multiple bilateral tax treaties at the same time. So there would be no need to individually renegotiate them. Now that same idea has been brought into the United Nations. And in this session of the UN Tax Committee, which just got over in October in Geneva, Marlene and myself were there. The decision was taken to really proceed with the development of a UN multilateral instrument. So this would function in the same way. It would take the good provisions from the UN Model Tax Convention, because as some of you may know, the UN Model Tax Convention is more beneficial to developing countries or source countries. It provides more taxing rights to the country of source. So these beneficial provisions could be taken and quickly plugged into existing bilateral tax treaties, especially of the developing countries, without the need for individually renegotiating them. So this would, in theory, a country could screen doesn't seem to be showing. Yeah, so so a country could, in theory, update all of its tax treaties through a single ratification of the UN MLI. So to give an example, let's say there's a country which has 40 treaties with 40 countries. So if this country A and all the 40 treaty partners ratify the UN MLI, agree on the provisions which have to be incorporated into the existing treaties, then the UN MLI would update all of these treaties automatically. They would not need to go to the parliament or their legislature with each treaty saying, okay, now we need to ratify and pass a new law and so on. So these time-taking legislative changes would be bypassed, which is the same advantage of the BEPS MLI. So one of the discussions was what should be these beneficial provisions which should go into the UNMLI, and 3 provisions have been selected for discussion as a priority. The first one is Article 12A, fees for technical services. This is really something which is not in the OECD Model Tax Convention, but it's there in the UN Model Tax Convention. And it's a very important provision for developing countries. And in fact, many treaty negotiations between developed and developing countries have stopped or been cancelled because of the refusal to include Article 12A. So Article 12A is one. Article 12B is a great achievement of the developing world. It was produced between 2020 to 2021 and is the developing world's alternative for taxing the digital economy. It provides a simple method or 2 simple methods for taxing income from automated digital services. And this is now Sri Lanka, Qatar, Oman, and Tanzania, to my knowledge, have now begun the process of including Article 12B into their bilateral tax treaties. And the South African Development Community's Model Tax Treaty is also planning to include Article 12B into that. So Article 12B is really very important for the developing countries. This is their alternative for the taxation of the digital economy from the OECD solution of Pillar 1. And the third one is the subject to tax rule. So the subject to tax rule is actually something which has come out of Pillar 2. It was, again, a contribution of developing countries. I won't get into the details of how that works, but it provides a way through which if 2 tax treaty partners are basically engaging in double non-taxation, it would solve that problem so that at least one of the treaty partners, the source country, would be able to tax the income at a minimum rate. So this is the subject to tax rule, which has now been introduced into the UN model. The efforts are being taken to introduce that into the UN Model Tax Convention. So these are some of the key provisions. Now, just a few, I've mentioned a few points on Article 12B already. It's on taxing income from automated digital services. The South Center and the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa, which is a special initiative of the African Union, have produced the world's first country-level revenue estimates for Amount A and Article 12B. I've provided the links here. This is the study which contains the data, but there is another study which contains evaluating the impact of Pillars 1 and 2, which contains country-level data for Amount A for the member states of the South Center. I invite all of you to look at that. And it contains open source data and a replicable methodology so countries can conduct an impact assessment for themselves. So just to give you a quick summary of our results. So if you look at this orange, this is basically the amount of money countries, the South Center's member states would get from Amount A. So it would range from 4.9 billion to 5.5 billion, but these are all from Article 12B from the different sources. And you can see that the range is much higher. I mean, at the maximum, they can get 11.4 billion compared to a maximum of 5.5 billion from Amount A. So there's really a much higher amount of revenue they can get from the UN solution. And the same applies for the African Union's member states, the 54 member states. From Amount A, they can get a maximum of 0.6 billion, whereas from the UN's various alternatives in Article 12B, they can get almost more than twice, 1.4 billion. So there's really a much higher revenue gain to be gotten from the UN's alternative for developing countries, which is why Article 12B has been chosen as one of the key provisions to be included into bilateral tax treaties through the UNMLI. Now, the UNMLI would also, in a way, be a UN tax convention because it would be an agreement which countries would have to sign and ratify. And it would have to be serviced by a conference of parties. So in that sense, it would not only be a UN tax convention, but it would also create an intergovernmental tax body. And this can really greatly disseminate the international tax standards of the UN. It's being negotiated in the UN Tax Committee subcommittee on taxation of the digitalized and globalized economy, and is something which requires the support of all of us. In conclusion, I would just like to say that, as David had mentioned, multinational enterprises are now, they require multilateral cooperation to be effectively taxed because these companies are really beyond the pale of many small individual countries to be effectively taxed. And the UN is a genuinely universal organization and provides the best possible forum for such international tax multilateralism. These 3 proposals which I've outlined, if implemented, can greatly boost international tax governance and provide fairer tax standards for the developing countries. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay, we next have Vera. Vera, can you come back, please? And my apologies for not formally introducing you earlier, but please, we'd love to have your contribution.
Thank you. I think you introduced me, but that's okay. So I am the chairperson of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, which is about raising capital for the continent. And I'm also the co-chair of the high-level panel for the UK and Egypt on climate finance. All of this very important to this discussion today. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here and for listening. I think we've heard a varied number of presentations, one from the OECD saying we've moved forward since 1960. And then there are the three panelists saying, well, maybe we've moved, but maybe not that far and maybe not that much and maybe not that inclusive enough. I think that maybe as I was listening to everybody, I was thinking, okay, so what can I say? I think looking at it from a developing country perspective, the OECD, of course, made a huge effort, and we all remember President Sarkozy. We all remember 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, and a huge reaction towards illicit financial flows or tax evasion and tax havens. And I had the privilege of working at the time at the World Bank with Ngozi, where we had launched the STAR initiative, Stolen Assets Recovery, and where we had been before 2008, 2009, talking about IFFs on the continent, and nobody cared about it. Come 2008, come 2009, global financial crisis, the French push President Sarkozy, God bless his heart, for this, at least bringing it back to the fore and saying we're going to go after every tax haven in the world and we're going to make sure that we close them. Clearly, we've had a rather maybe distant relationship with tax havens, but we've kept them. So that shows that from 2009 to today, maybe Sarkozy hasn't gotten what he wanted. But what it also did was it brought the IFFs back into sort of a conversation. Right now, it was not only the developing countries that were worrying about tax havens and stolen assets and illicit financial flows. It was the whole world because we needed resources. So that was a good thing. The second good thing was the OECD said, oh, and then we had, of course, the big controversies around the big seven, the Microsoft, Facebooks, Googles, and do they pay taxes in Ireland or the United States or something? And I think a very, very aggressive and rightly so European Competition Policy Agency that sort of went after, what are these big agencies, particularly the digital services, doing. So there were different things happening, right? And it all came back to the illicit financial flows conversation, the BEPS conversation in different ways. Now, I think OECD takes the credit for taking the lead and for doing the work on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And as you all know, I disagree with Pillar 1 because they keep mining companies out of it, which is a huge source of resources for the developing countries. And so doing any kind of tax policy that says, let's exempt the mining companies is a problem. Pillar 2, of course, looks mostly at the digital services. But the big question that I have, and you talked a lot about sort of the OECD being more inclusive. Nigeria was probably the most participatory in this discussion. Nigeria did not sign in the end. Nigeria is our largest economy on the continent. Nigeria, remember, in some sense, Nigeria doesn't sign anything in the beginning. Nigeria didn't sign the AFCFTA when the whole continent signed, because they have the largest one of the largest industrial bases on the continent. Of course, South Africa and Egypt and a few others come behind, and Kenya did not sign as well. But this gives you a sense that we're beginning to think as a continent of what we could do better. And I think Abdul has demonstrated that there are alternatives, and listening to the developing world in some of these forums is important. I come from a space where now we're looking a lot at global financial architecture and how we should modify it. My strong belief is that the modification of the global tax architecture will not happen inside the OECD. A modification of the global tax architecture has to happen in economies that are themselves suffering from it. And I believe that the African economies, and yes, the African constituency is coming together. We need as a continent, first of all, to agree on what we want to take forward. And I think once that happens, and it is happening, maybe it's not in the UN, maybe it's at the IMF, maybe it's in other spaces, will we be able to have, I think, the kind of influence that is needed? I think three things. The other thing that nobody has talked about is capacity. And then the with most of these revisions of treaties, and it's the same with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, you need multilateral conventions and the restructuring or the redrafting and the re-agreement of all of this. We all know that in many of our countries, before Parliament meets and restructures, redrafts, and passes any of these conventions, it can take 5 to 7 years. So essentially, again, first of all, the capacity to redraft, to change the laws is going to take a lot of time. And I think we do need to focus some of our attention on that. I used to work at the Economic Commission for Africa, where we did a report on what are the institutions that are needed in African economies to be able at least to honor some of these conventions, to ensure that, we can actually come together in this global coordinated fashion that you talked about as the OECD is trying to put in place. Mutual legal agreements under the IFFs, many of us don't have the right, jurisdictional institutions to be able to even draft the legal agreements, to follow up on them. We have tried with Tunisia, with Egypt, trying to go after stolen assets, hitting ourselves because every country says, oh, but you haven't signed this, or you haven't done this, or you haven't done that. And this is essentially what makes sure that nothing really happens. And so the large corporations, go away. So my sense is, while we continue to do some of the work that the OECD is doing, but I believe Africa needs to do that, we must look at what are the institutions that are needed. Many African institutions do not have a well-staffed legal department in their tax agency. So that is just a basic, right? If you don't have that as a basic, and that's probably why we don't even participate in many of these conventions and discussions. When you look at the numbers of who really participated in the work on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, in terms of actual participation, it's 3 countries scattered in Africa, it's 2 countries from South Asia, it's many of the OECD countries. So can we really say that it was participatory? No, but it was not because the others didn't want to, but maybe because they just didn't have the capacity. So I think we need to go back to this capacity question and see, and I think the ATEF and the FATF and many other institutions on the continent are beginning to see how we can build that capacity so that we can do better. Otherwise, I think we will just keep coming back here and saying, oh, it's a colonial thing and the OECD is doing it. But it is our responsibility to ensure that we build those institutions so that, the South Center is doing amazing work, but maybe we need more and we need some support for Southern Africa also has a huge. So I wanted to sort of come back to sort of, first of all, that there's the capacity issue that we need to look at. In the OECD, there is huge capacity there to do some of this work. So maybe you're stepping in because there is a vacuum, but I think to be able to step in and do it in a way that is really inclusive, we need to make sure that there is capacity from the others so that they can actually come to the table and have the right kind of conversation with you. The second thing I think is when we do this, I think really domestic resource mobilization is what Africa or what the developing world is looking for. And when we look at Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and what we get out of it, $100 billion are some of the estimates. This is almost sort of, all this effort for that. We must ask ourselves, are we doing the right things? Actually, as was shown in one of the slides, a lot of actually the benefits of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are taken off again by the developed economies because probably they have negotiated better and stronger. And so I think there is some maybe conversation again about the equity of some of these conversations and some of the designs that we've put in place. And if you take, for example, under Pillar 2, the question around tax rules and which rules should we be using, I think that right now, again, it is skewed in the direction of the developed economy. So we do need to look at that as not only are we redrafting tax rules, but we are trying to maybe provide a little bit more equity into the system and ask ourselves if, as we have it today, it is delivering on that second objective, which is the objective of equity. So I don't think it is fully doing that. So I think that's something else that we need to look at. The third thing is on the issue of incentives. I think we have all in at least in my line of business, we keep telling our government not to give incentives because incentives are bad. We say, provide good policy, provide good infrastructure, and then let everybody pay taxes. I think that the way that, especially on the Pillar 2, there are, we are risking going backwards into sort of, countries trying to sort of have a race to the bottom 12.5% as sort of the sort of base tax level, which we know is not going to be satisfactory. It's actually going to take us down. We are now at an average of 17 to 20% tax revenue to GDP on our continent. We need to get to 34. We will never get there if we started at 12.5 as the base. And so I think, again, we need to relook at some of these things and see whether we are doing it in a way that responds to the development challenges, needs, and imperatives for getting to prosperity fast enough on the continent. So these are, I think, maybe 3 things that I just wanted to put on the table, or 4. Maybe one is to say that I don't want to sort of, bash the OECD because they're filling a vacuum. They came in, they stepped in at a time when we were all talking about IFFs. We all knew the system needed to be relooked at. They started a piece of work. I think clearly what we now need to do, so that's number 1, is the OECD at the very least has shown us what we need to do more, better, and differently. But for us to be able to do that, point 2 is we need to build more capacity in the emerging market economies to ensure that when they come to, first, that they come to the table, and 2, that they come to the table in a way that is consistent. Maybe that the OECD supports the demand for a G77 group or UN tax group, so that you come into that and make it a much more inclusive. Then I think the word inclusive will be really meaningful in some sense. And then tax rules, and ensuring that we use tax rules in the jurisdictions that we're working on, as opposed to, because that also means changing legislations, which again, without capacity, makes it very difficult. And then finally, to just be very careful with incentives and how some of this new suggestions on the Pillar 2 especially play with incentives and could lead to a race to the bottom. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Vera. So, David, you're not being bashed, but you are certainly in the hot seat. And we want to take it back to the topic, which is illicit financial flows. And I think that is, and governance. And I think that is where you started off by saying that these were perennial issues. And so the OECD came up with strategies which, through the conduit of international cooperation, to deal with some of these issues. Now, how do you see the impact of Pillar 2, particularly on the issues of illicit financial flows and the tax governance?
Well, thanks very much, Marlene. I don't feel as though I've been bashed, but you should feel like you've been bashed a little, because you're actually a co-chair of the Inclusive Framework on BEPS. And one of the things that we need to emphasize here is when people talk about the OECD, we are a member-based organization, but on international tax matters, we are not the 38 OECD countries, we are the 141 jurisdictions. We operate by consensus. Now, yes, the statement that was agreed, there were 4 countries that chose not to agree to that statement. But the remaining jurisdictions have been investing, and even those that have not signed up to the statement have been investing in this process. So when we talk about the OECD, let's be careful what we're really talking about. Are we talking about the 38 member countries that have essentially allowed this new body to be created, where countries come together on an equal footing? Or are we talking about the Inclusive Framework on BEPS? In terms of some of the comments that have been made, just if I can respond in addressing the issue of Pillar 2. It's entirely legitimate for people to express their strong views about what is the appropriate forum for international tax negotiations to take place in. But I think we need to be honest, and we need to not mislead. And there have been a number of things that have been said today that I have found to be misleading, because I know them to not be right. Now, if we think, for example, I hear a discussion about Pillar 1 and how it's not appropriate that the extractive sector would be excluded. because African countries will often rely upon extractive industries and therefore it should be included. This is actually misleading. Pillar 1 reallocates taxing rights. It would take the rights to tax extractive industries in a developing country and reallocate some of that right to another country that is the customer of that jurisdiction. The reason why extractives has been excluded from Pillar 1 has largely been because of advocacy of developing countries. So there's no conspiracy here to exclude mining companies. It's actually developing countries and some developed. I come from Australia. It's an OECD country, but we never really thought of ourselves as colonialists. We were the convicts that the British sent to the other side of the world. But when you think about a country like Australia, yes, it's a developed country, but it's also got a very strong resource base. Many African countries have similar characteristics. And on this particular issue, they actually worked together to ensure that that extractives exclusion was a part of Pillar 1. So just to clarify that. On Pillar 2, I think the thing about Pillar 2 is that there's been a very big debate about rule order. And there's a mix of people in the room. Some of you will know the detail of this more than others. But the whole idea of the rule order is that Pillar 2, the reason why it will be effective, even if you don't have every country in the world introduce it, is because it has these series of interlocking rules. And what it means is that if one country decides to tax profit at less than 15%, that's an effective rate. If one country chooses to do that, then there will be a series of cascading rights to other countries that can step in and top up that tax to the 15%. And so what it basically means is that if you are a country that says, I want to offer tax rates below 15% to attract investment, then you know that at least up to that 15%, some other country is going to top up the tax. And it takes away the incentive to produce effective tax rates below the 15%. And because it's cascading, there's a series of different rules that allow someone else to take that top-up tax. That's why Pillar 2 will work, even if you don't have 100% of countries implemented. Now, when it comes to rule order, there was a very big debate in the early stages of this project because priority was given to one particular rule, and that was the income inclusion rule. And what this basically meant was that if the country where the activity was occurring did not tax up to the 15%, then the headquarter jurisdiction could take the top-up tax. And when we look at where the bulk of large multinationals are headquartered, most of them are headquartered in developed countries. And that was a legitimate point that was made. But that debate is an old debate now because we've had a more recent evolution of the rules that has introduced an idea of a qualified domestic minimum top-up tax. What this is, it would allow the source jurisdiction to have a top-up tax that will collect that minimum 15%. And that rule would take priority over any other rule. And so what that means is that if you are a developing country that might have a big multinational operating in your jurisdiction that is headquartered in, say, France, if you didn't have the qualified domestic minimum top-up tax and the firm was generating an effective tax rate of less than 15%, under the income inclusion rule, France could have topped that up. But now that we have the qualified domestic minimum top-up tax, the source jurisdiction, let's say, for example, it was Senegal, just to pick an example in Africa. Senegal could introduce the qualified domestic minimum top-up tax. And that would mean that they collect that extra tax, not France, which happens to be the headquarter country. Now, when we talk about who's going to get the revenue, it's absolutely essential to consider basic facts like this. And the qualified domestic top-up tax will change that dynamic. But this is really important on the question of incentives. And this is something that I really have to make the point very strongly. I think one of the best things about Pillar 2 is that it will take away some of the pressure that many developing countries currently feel to offer tax incentives. We all know how it works. The big multinational comes to town and they say, we're only going to do business in your jurisdiction if you give us an attractive tax rate. And in fact, if you give us a tax holiday. Now, under the new arrangements, in a world where Pillar 2 is implemented, you'll have a situation where big multinational coming to town can say, well, give me a tax holiday. But because of these cascading rules, even if the local jurisdiction chooses not to collect the 15%, the company knows that some other jurisdiction is going to collect that top-up tax somewhere. And what that means is that the local jurisdiction, the source jurisdiction, can collect up to 15%. It's not going to affect their competitiveness because, frankly, the multinational can't get a better deal than that anywhere else because they're going to be subject to top-up tax. And at the same time, they're able to collect additional revenues. And this is about mobilising domestic resources. So Pillar 2 is not only going to provide additional revenues globally, and we've estimated that they are in the order of $150 billion a year. More recent modelling suggests it might even be higher than that, but we'll be updating on impact assessment in the new year. Significant amount of money, but what we also see is that it will be important in particular for developing countries, not just in protecting their tax base, but ensuring that they will be able to have investment in their jurisdiction without having to completely forego their tax base in order to have that investment. I think that's going to be a significant outcome of this project. So in terms of Pillar 2 and what that means, Marlene, I think it will be a game changer. And if you are a country that currently has all of these tax incentives that you use to try and attract investment, you're going to have to reconsider that, because some of those tax incentives are probably going to be wasted because you'll be reducing the effective tax rate of a company that's going to go and get taxed somewhere else because you've chosen to do that. That won't make sense. And technical assistance is something that we've been spending a lot of time and effort in supporting developing countries, and this is a particular priority of ours. We have already announced that a number of pilot projects that we'll be doing with developing countries on Pillar 2, not just focused on helping them understand how to implement the rules, but in particular, helping them understand how this interacts with tax incentives so that they can make sure that any incentives that they have in place will actually put a floor on that tax competition. So far from this being something that I think will lead to a race to the bottom, it's actually for the first time in history, we'll be putting in place some sort of multilaterally agreed limit to the depths to which that tax competition can sink. Because people assume at the moment that the floor to tax competition is 0%. It's actually not. Because you could subsidise investment in your jurisdiction. You could have a negative tax rate if you really wanted to. There's nothing to stop that. Pillar 2 is not just about plugging a floor in at 0. It's about saying an effective tax rate of 15%. I think that's going to be a game changer. I know that many countries around the world are taking this very seriously, both developed and developing countries. I was participating in an event with the IMF recently that they hosted in Asia, and a number of the countries there are actively looking at how they might recalibrate, repeal, or reform their tax incentives in order to ensure that their regimes make sense under Pillar 2. That's the proof in the pudding, is that countries are already starting to do that. So I'm very optimistic about what Pillar 2 might achieve, and look forward to continuing to work with countries to bring its implementation into effect.
All right, thank you very much, David. Abdul, I think you want to weigh in, and perhaps at the same time, you could comment on Vera's point that there is not much revenue to be gained from the two-pillar solution, and that what countries really want is domestic resource mobilization. And so the two-pillar solution may not necessarily contribute in any meaningful way to that. So perhaps you can weigh in on David's response and address that issue as well.
Thank you, Marlene. So I have 3 points on David's comments on the two-pillar solution. The first one is the motivation behind why now there has been a global minimum tax. And one of the big factors is the Trump administration. Because if you remember, what they didn't want was for companies to go to China and set up businesses over there. And one of the ways they wanted to punish companies from going away from the US was by taking away the tax advantage. So this was really one of the big political motivations behind the global minimum tax, which has now seen its way into becoming an international standard. And kudos to the OECD for providing the technical basis for making that happen. The second point is that one thing to look at now is what qualifies as a qualified domestic minimum top-up tax, because many developing countries have alternative minimum taxes of various kinds. Some are on turnover and some are on assets and so on. So it's important that there should be a framework through which these can be recognized as qualified. Otherwise, there would be disputes, and this is something which should be taken forward as the implementation framework is developed. The third aspect to look at is the impact on royalties and intellectual property, because right now, many of the tech companies and pharmaceutical companies locate their intellectual property in tax havens. And Pillar 2 will actually mean that some of these IP rights will be shifted away from the tax havens. So this will have dynamics which are yet to be foreseen and will significantly impact the intellectual property regime as well. Now, coming to Marlene's question, as you can see from the South Center's revenue estimates, developing countries stand to get between 3 to 5 times revenue from Article 12B, specifically from the gross method as compared to Amount A. And Article 12B's gross method can be seen as a substitute for a digital service tax. And a digital service tax is basically a simple withholding tax on each payment on a digital service. So the question is, should developing countries go with something enormously complicated, which will not give much money, and which requires developed countries to first implement it for it to be successful, which may or may not happen, when they really need revenue at a time of multiple crises? Or should they go with something which some of them have implemented successfully? Countries like Kenya, countries like Nigeria, Tanzania has recently introduced a digital service tax, India and so on, which is actually bringing in revenue and is a simple known resource. So this is a question, because many of the inclusive framework members have also agreed to not undertake any unilateral measures till the OECD solution goes ahead. Now, the question is how long this stalemate will continue. And as per the data, at least from whatever we have seen, at a country level, developing countries have far more to gain from the UN's alternative of Article 12B, which is again a substitute for a digital service tax through the gross method, but the net method also provides an alternative, which is a tax on profits instead of turnover. And both of these can be considered to eliminate double taxation because they have a treaty-based solution. So I would say that the UN's alternative, at least from a revenue perspective, gives much more to developing countries than the OECD's of Amount A.
Thank you very much, Abdul. Markus, your view is that all of this is academic, that the OECD has spent months and delegates have gone to Paris, and there are all kind of task force meetings and so on, but neither of the two pillars will ever be realized. That's your view. If not, then what do you see as the solution to the global standard setting, as well as the erosion and the base erosion and profit shifting that is take place? I know you spoke about the UN, but these are immediate problems. Those are prospective. So then how do countries deal with these particular issues? And do they all resort to unilateral measures, which of themselves are problematic?
Thank you. I do think that the building blocks for a truly ambitious unilateral or regional alternative tax regimes for corporate taxation are now in place with the two pillars, like the both maybe myths or constraints that have been there in the last decades. One with regard to unitary taxation, to the idea of formulary apportionment of profits, has been broken or overcome in Pillar 1. And the second constraint was the sort of race to the bottom of not interfering in the tax rate setting rights of other nations, has been overcome with Pillar 2, with the idea of a minimum tax rate, the need for it. So I think these two components can be put together by countries in a form of a minimum effective tax rates, minimum effective tax proposal. There's a proposal on the table developed by Salpi Chowdhary and some others for countries to consider the combined implementation of formulary apportioning multinationals' profits in a country's jurisdiction and then applying their own domestic tax rate to that portion of profit. I think we have the legitimacy now for countries to move in that regard. That is a concrete possibility to move forward and build upon what the OECD has, I think, in the Pillar 1 and 2 work compared to BEPS phase 1. At least they have overcome these two sort of mental blocks or mental sort of myths that were there as a constraint in the past. So there's no answer to spell out all the policy solutions that can be put, but I do think that the United Nations as a standard setting organization and as a convening place for countries for setting up, for example, a center of monitoring taxing rights, to provide public goods such as the country-by-country reporting data would be important steps towards ensuring the longevity and sustainability of these processes. So we have a buy-in institutionally at an international level that supports the notion that multinational companies, for example, are not above the law, but have to at least provide the public good of country-by-country reporting data. And here, I think also it's fair to remind us that the stewardship of the OECD, that's not a blaming again for David here, but it's a failing of the leadership of the OECD and the member states, has failed to live up to that mandate, right? The country-by-country reporting was, when it was finally negotiated and agreed, already watered down so much that the technical robustness has suffered tremendously, not to speak of the lack of public disclosure of the country-by-country report. So we now have the Global Reporting Initiative voluntary standard that is much more robust, and many multinationals increasingly are subscribing to voluntarily publish according to that standard. But also the OECD has failed to live up to even consider its mandate in the BEPS project after 5 years to review the standard and publish a revision and an evaluation of the country-by-country reporting. That was in 2013 or 15, depending on when you start counting. And we're in 2022, and there's nothing of that evaluation to be seen. And we are at the moment only having the last CBCR data of 2017 published in last 2021. So the OECD's guardian's role of failing to fulfill its mandate to provide this public good of country-by-country reporting data, even in an aggregate and non-company-by-company basis. All right, that is what we're talking about. In 2021, they last published the aggregate version of that. They haven't been able to republish it this time, and they have failed to run this public evaluation and draw the conclusions. Rather, they have run an evaluation, but they have failed to produce conclusions to improve the standard. So I think this is why a Center for Monitoring Global Taxing Rights at the United Nations is of paramount importance as one of the building blocks going forward.
Okay, thank you, Markus. Vera.
Marlene, can I just quickly, just one point there, country-by-country reporting data, we're not suppressing this data. It's anonymized and aggregated data. In 2 weeks' time, I can tell you all, in 2 weeks' time, the 2018 data will be published, which is the lag period that exists just because we have to collect all this information from the countries themselves. So, there's no conspiracy here. The data will be published. And in fact, next year, we're going to publish 2 years of data to catch up we've been working with the countries to do that. So, you know, in terms of these things, you know, criticisms always well received where they're fair, but that will be published in just a couple of weeks' time.
Okay, so colleagues, you heard it here first. In 2 weeks' time, you can look for the data to be published from the OECD. We're going to change focus a little now. And Vera, you're still with us?
I am.
Great. Okay, so the World Bank, in its recent report, Taxing Crime, the title goes on to say a whole of government approach to fighting corruption, money laundering, and tax crimes that report states that the interconnectedness of the crimes of IFFs, corruption, and money laundering require a whole of government approach. Do you agree? And how can governments effectively deal with the silo effect in the departments and agencies? And outside of that, we'd also like to get your views on what else can be done at the domestic policy level to mitigate the effects of these crimes.
Oh, thank you.
Before colleagues, you have not been forgotten. You will have 10 minutes in which you can field your questions. Please go ahead, Vera.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll be short. I think just to go back to the last conversation quickly, the next and last point on sort of transparency, data transparency, is so critically important. And I'm happy to talk about top-ups and when it happens and all, but if you don't have transparency in who is paying what when, and if it comes out 5 years later, it's very difficult to do that. So again, I think there's some of the more easy things that we need to be able to see whether we can do better and faster so that particularly the developing countries can do well. This links to your question. I think Senegal, let me take Senegal again as a good example. Senegal created, when President Macky Sall came into power, the CREE, which was sort of an overarching AML CFTA sort of agency, right, that was going after tax evasion, corruption, and all that. And I think the purpose of that agency was to be able to coordinate the rest of government, because again, you know, we have sort of tax issues in the mining sector, in the agriculture sector, of course, in the revenue departments and in schools. So being able to bring that together in one agency that sort of has that overarching role is particularly important. And I think that's one of the things that many governments on the continent are beginning to look at, to see whether, you know, institutions like the CREE in Senegal are the right way to go. It ends up being sort of, you know, over the emprise, like they would say in French, of the league of the judicial system. But I think it's also very important, we learned at the time, to make sure that, you know, agencies like the Supreme Audit also have a very important role, and that the audit reports, and that's where transparency and availability of information become important, that audit reports are made public annually to every year, so that if in many countries, the government or the head of state or somebody has to sign audit reports before they become available to the general public. But we've seen even in countries like the Philippines, where tax transparency, and there's a very active civil society around tax laws and the judiciary, that, you know, more transparency and more involvement of civil society in access to the audit reports allows actually for better performance. So I think that what you need are two things. One is an agency that brings together all of these different institutions. You need a very, very strong, and the Philippines again is another good example of that, a very, very strong legal department in the Internal Revenue or tax collection agency of the country as a beginning. And then after that, I think sort of bringing together the different parts of the system. In many of these countries, the multilateral agencies work with SOEs that are sort of outside the government's direct fiscal books. And so there is very, very easy and open room for tax evasion, and you need to bring that together. So that would be my suggestion is, one, have an umbrella agency in the critical agencies in your country, make sure that you have the legal judiciary and audit capabilities and respect the audit reports, make them public annually, and hopefully we can get the international companies' audit reports as well to those countries on time.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll now open the floor for participants. Okay, there's one question. Another question here.
Hi, my name is Lydia Kilpi. I'm from the EITI. Thanks very much for the interesting discussion. We're the global standard for good governance in oil, gas, and mining. And IFFs are, of course, a huge issue in this sector. And about a half of our 57 member countries are African countries. So we hear that voice very, very loudly, and preventing IFFs in the sector, including public beneficial ownership registers and an international tax architecture that enables preventing profit shifting is very important. Even more so now with the environmental crisis, shifting demand in fossil fuels, and the increasing demand for transition minerals. I actually have two questions. The first one is now related to the ongoing discussion about the UN Tax Convention and the global tax body. G77 isn't actually 77 countries. It's, if I remember correctly, 134 developing countries, plus you have the group of African states then calling for these reforms. And we've heard throughout this conference and today at the donor roundtable that there's a lot of commitment from development partners in supporting domestic resource mobilization in the global south. How are these countries, like for example, the EU, now positioning themselves towards this call from developing countries on increasing the UN's role? And my second question is actually related to country by country reporting. Since the BEPS reports were agreed, this landscape has changed quite a lot. There's a GRI standard on tax. And in the extractive sector, we have a long legacy of tax and revenue transparency. And in addition to the mandatory reporting, increasing number of extractive companies like Eni, Shell, Newmont, BHP are also voluntarily disclosing public country by country reports. So is the OECD planning on championing on public CBCR in the coming years as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just a basic. I'm wondering, it's just a basic thought I have. But David said that thanks to Pillar 2, there will be at least a minimum level for an effective tax rate of 15%, if I'm not mistaken. But how do you consider issues such as transfer pricing or other alternative aggressive optimization method that multinational usually refer to? And sorry, I don't remember your name, but you talked about I think it's Pillar 2.B or something like this. So how does this transfer price stick into this framework also on the UN Convention? Thank you.
Just to take that last question first. So the global effective minimum tax is not going to be a substitute for a range of other BEPS related measures. So in that instance, the global effective minimum tax will look at the effective tax rate that is being generated on a jurisdictional basis. And if that effective tax rate is below 15%, then there'll be rights among different countries to top up to the 15. Now, if 15% effective tax is being paid in the jurisdiction, then the minimum tax cannot be invoked at that point. But it is possible that there's still transfer pricing abuse that might be occurring. And that's where many of the existing rules need to be relied upon, and some of those that were augmented through the BEPS process. There is one additional point that I'd make, and that is that when I've been talking about the 15%, I've basically been talking about what we call the globe rules as part of Pillar 2. But there is also something called the subject to tax rule, which allows a country to withhold in certain circumstances, certain types of payments. So it may be in the particular case that you're describing that there may be some recourse through the subject to tax rule in order to be able to withhold additional tax in respect of specific types of payments that might otherwise be characterised as some form of transfer mispricing or some form of abuse. So that's, I guess, at a high level, that's the response to that. On the question of CBCR reporting, and I should just clarify before, because Vera pointed out, it's a long period of delay for the publication of the data, and that's true, because the original agreement amongst the countries that signed up to the BEPS project was that the CBCR data would be for the primary purpose of empowering tax administrations, and its purpose would not be for publication or for broader public appeal. But one of the things that we did, and I led the team that did this back in 2013 to 2015, was we said, well, okay, if that's the agreement, that some countries object and won't sign up to the global arrangement, then what can we bring into the public domain that might still be helpful in terms of economic analysis and future impact assessment? And we worked with countries to then produce that data on an anonymised and aggregated basis, because their principal objection was one of confidentiality. Now, we can have a debate about whether there should be confidentiality in those circumstances or not, but the reality is for a whole range of countries, their existing confidentiality provisions did not allow them to release the underlying country-by-country reports. So what we did was we worked with countries to provide that data to us in a harmonised way that we could then publish. And in fact, Tax Justice Network has been one of the greatest users of our data that we've made available. And we do that as a public good. We don't receive any funding to do that. We do that, but we think it's really important to shine a light on and allow future economic analysis of BEPS and various corporate tax related issues to inform policy in the future. On the issue of public reporting of the underlying data, is that something that the OECD is currently advocating for? Well, to the extent that this is a discussion for the inclusive framework on BEPS, I think the answer at present is that that is not the case, that no one is advocating for that through that forum, because I think it's unlikely at this point that consensus could be reached on that issue, because there are still a number of countries that feel very strongly that country-by-country reporting is fine to empower tax administrations to make sure that from a risk assessment perspective, they understand the global operations of the company, but it's another question to then publicly release that. Now, personally, when I was a minister before I came to the OECD, I was a minister in the Australian government, and I introduced some very wide-ranging transparency provisions. And I saw that in Australia today, they released data under those provisions, right? So, this is not a question of what my personal view on this might be, but when you're operating in a multilateral context where consensus is the principle that allows you to either move forward on issues or not, sometimes on issues such as these, there is not agreement amongst countries to move towards full publication of that information. I think that continues to be the case when I talk to the various members of the inclusive framework. But of course, individual countries are free to start to do what it is within their sovereign powers that might require additional material being reported. And I see in Australia, the current government in their recent budget announced some measures that will head more in that direction. So it is open to countries to move in that direction. It's not something anyone at the OECD is stopping anyone from doing. But the real question for us is, can consensus be reached amongst the 141 members in order to make it public? And I think it's unlikely at this point in time.
I think Abdul, you wanted to speak to the UN Tax Convention?
Yes, and the question on Article 12B. So on the UN Tax Convention, I'll just give a bit of brief history very quickly. Typically, what has been the process is that whenever developing countries have demanded a UN tax body, but I'll take a step back. You know, the reality is that most of the multinationals are based in the developed countries, and the OECD standards have effectively acted to reduce their taxes or allocate the taxing right to the developed countries where these companies are based. I'll give you two examples. We have the the OECD Model Convention, which allocates taxing rights to the countries of residence, more or less. And you have the transfer pricing guidelines, which allocate profits on a functions, assets, and risks basis. So jurisdictions where there are big industries, a lot of assets, and which can take a lot of risks, which are usually the developed countries, would be attributed more of the profits than the developing countries. Now, if this process of standard setting is opened up to all countries, including developing countries, this would mean that the multinationals where the OECD, which are headquartered in the OECD countries, would have to pay more taxes. So practically, this has been fiercely resisted by the OECD countries whenever this demand for a UN tax body has come up, or a UN tax convention. So the historical response has been that the OECD has expanded itself and become a little more inclusive and given minor concessions to the UN. A big example of this is 2015, when in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, there was a big push for a UN tax body, and that's as a response to that, the inclusive framework was created, and an additional session was added to the UN Tax Committee. Earlier, they met only once in April in New York, but then they also started meeting in October in Geneva. Then a second major push, I think, happened a few years later. And I think the inclusive framework membership was like further expanded. And I think they now have a co-chair from the developing world who's sitting right next to me. And there are further changes planned to make the governance system more inclusive. So my prediction is that going forward, we would see more of this. The inclusive framework would try to undertake some reforms and become more inclusive, and a few minor concessions would be thrown in the UN's direction, but there would be no real attempt to give up this essential power struggle, because that means higher taxes for the multinationals. So they would really resist it very strongly. Now, for the question on Article 12B, you know, on transfer pricing is under Article 9 of the Model Conventions, which is associated enterprises. And this comes up when there is a profit under Article 7, which assumes that there is a permanent establishment under Article 5. Now, Article 12B operates on a transaction basis. So let's say somebody pays for a Netflix subscription $100, and the country has a 3% withholding rate. So $3 would be kept in the pocket of the country, and the company would get $97. I mean, just give a very simplistic example of the gross method. Net method would take more time than I have, but it's also fairly simple to apply. So the transfer pricing concept doesn't come here because it's on a transaction basis, on a turnover basis, not on a profit basis.
I want to speak about the OECD positioning on CBCR. All that we know, and it's not a lot that we know because it's confidential negotiations, is that the EU is at the moment blocking this and trying to remove the UN tax convention from any chance of being realized. And that is sort of an appeal to all of us to think, if we have connections to EU member states, finance ministries, to try to make inroads there and explain the need for a shift. I think that it will come possibly with the failure of Pillar 1 and 2, or increasing evidence of the failure of the pillars, that there might be more appetite to deviate from the OECD consensus. I mean, we have already cracks in the OECD consensus based on the authorized OECD approach on transfer pricing, where a lot of OECD members themselves haven't subscribed to the proposed tightening of the allowed methodologies. But I wanted to also make one broader point about the consensual decision-making, which has come up a number of times now. What happens in reality is that the OECD is bound to defend its members' interests, right? Article 1 of the OECD Founding Convention binds the OECD organization to defend its members' economies, not inclusive framework economies, not others, just the member economies. So if there's a conflict, and data protection is a good example, that there are some preferences by a few member states to have data protection, confidentiality of CBCR very high on the agenda. So they devise a very overly complex process, which in the end results, and this is a fact, you can read it in the Young UNCTAD report, which results in lower income countries not having virtually no access to CBCR reports. So what you end up with is an exacerbation of inequalities in taxing rights based on the OECD's policies, which are supposed to change something. It's a very progressive potential, but the OECD has the power to tweak not only this, also the automatic information exchange. There's a case to argue the same thing, to tweak those policies to serve in the end only the interests of the membership of the OECD, primarily, with very marginal, if any, benefits to non-members, and excluding often lower income countries from any of those benefits. And it's also important to say that consensus in inclusive framework means, in some instances, to receiving midnight calls from the embassy to sign this thing now or face blackmail or blacklisting. This is a reality. This happened, and we know it for a fact. This is the way how OECD members treat inclusive membership to force them to sign some of these agreements. This has happened, and this is the way how the OECD is defining an equal footing. And this is a fake and a farce. Sorry, you will understand that it's very difficult to come up with these.
Sorry, Markus,
There's a reason we can't say this because of the protection of the people involved, of course. So it's your word against my word.
Please, I'd hope that we would have been able to end on a different note. However, we have come to the end, and I want to thank all of you for sticking with us, for asking your questions, for listening, and I'm going to give you some homework. Having heard and having witnessed what you have, your homework is to think about the future of multilateralism in the global tax landscape and its contribution to sustainable development. I think that you can think about it over dinner, but I think that it is an issue that we really need to ponder. I really want to thank the panelists this afternoon for their thoughts, for their expertise, for their knowledge, and really, I think what was a very robust discussion. Thank you all very much.